Hey guys, my name is Jay. Welcome to my channel. This is where I like to share my art projects with you and let it be known I like board games, particular miniature based board games. And today I'll be working on 3 of the different types of Space Marines, once again from the Space Crusade board game from the 1990s. This is an ongoing project of mine, so there was a previous video I'd made based on the Dreadnought. If you want to check that out, I'll leave a link down below. And I've painted a few different board game miniatures in the past, over the last few years. Some such as Doom, the D&D Stranger Things Demigorgon, and a few others as well. So this isn't specifically a Warhammer painting guide, it's more of a board game miniature painting guide in general. I'll be using a few different colours, including yellow, which has always been fun to use, but you will find it's quite simple. And also I'll be putting in a few magnets to magnetise some of the parts that are interchangeable. So I've not done that before, so you'll have to bear with me and we'll see how we go. Stick around. So like with any miniatures or models, we need to do the prep work first. This may or may not include cutting them from the sprues, so use cutters. Use a nice sharp knife to get rid of those mold lines and do any sanding that is required. Next, glue the components together that need to be glued, like the backpack for example on the back of the Marine. And if there are any parts you think might make it harder to paint the model, just leave them off and we'll paint them individually and glue them on later. Now I'm just going to push the base on, I'm not going to glue it, and I'll explain why later on. And I'm just going to repeat this process with the remaining figures. Now anytime I ever skip this step, I've always regretted it, so I guarantee you guys will too. Prep your models. And there we have it, all ready for priming. Now when it comes to priming, if you're using an aerosol, test the plastic first in case there's a reaction. Now another thing that's going to be first for me is drilling the barrel holes out of the gun. Now I never usually do this, I think it's just being lazy. So get the biggest screw you can find and just drill. I'm kidding, get yourself a pin vise, buy them online, super cheap, and use this for all your miniature holes. And as you can see, the effect is well worth it. Now that these have all been primed, let's chuck some paint on them. Now you can use a paintbrush, but I'll be using an airbrush for this. Select the dark blue and airbrush flow improver. So when using this darker blue, I'm making sure to angle from a lower position, that way I get all the underside where all the shadows may be. And this can help create that natural lighting effect. Then I'll be grabbing the lighter blue, which will essentially be the mid-tone. Spray that from a higher angle, trying not to get too much on the underside. Next we're going to paint the blue hands on the bolt gun. Add all the blacks into the joints and the hoses, that way it's easy to repair early on if you do make a mistake. And as you can see, the blue paint goes on quite well without worrying too much about the opacity. Our next step will be to block in some colours. We've got the browns for the little satchels around the belt, and we're going to add in the gold for the crest at the front. Now I do find some golds vary from paint to paint, so you may need to do a couple of layers, you may need to thin it down, just experiment. And just trying to be as neat as possible when applying this so you don't get onto the blue. Next, add some red in for the eyes. I like to use red for the blue, I think it's a good contrast. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of shade to the recesses, especially around where the gold edging is, just to finish that off. Now I like to run a little bit of flesh shade over the gold areas, just darkens them up a little bit, ready for those highlights. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm just going to paint the bolt gun black. Now we're going to use one of the most simplest of techniques, the dry brush. So use a lighter blue, get most of the paint off, and just drag it across the high points and creating a little bit of an edge highlight there. And for the broad areas like the shoulder pads, just work on it lightly till you are happy with it. Now I'm just going over the black areas like the hoses with a bit of silver. Use a finer brush as you don't get silver into the areas you don't want it to. And then add some chips and scratches to the side of the bolt gun. Add a bit of Neon oil for some shading, just to finish off those metallic parts. So while we wait for that to dry, we'll move on to the second Space Marine, the Blood Angel. Now we're going to lightly paint this in red, give it a couple of layers, and we're going to approach this slightly differently from the previous one. We're going to cover it all in a Neon oil, which will naturally darken the red, as well as it'll seep into the cracks and crevices, creating those shadows that we're after. Once you finish covering the model, we'll move on to doing the bolt gun. Then onto starting the Imperial Fist Space Marine. This is the yellow Space Marine. So Like the first Marine, we are going to paint all the underside in a brown. I find this is a good darker color for the shadows. And yellow always goes on best with an airbrush. When you use a paintbrush, you get the streaks. It takes a lot more time, a lot more layers to build up to that solid color. Now, while I wait, I'm going to grab the Blood Angel Space Marine, get the original red that I used to base coat it, and just go back over, avoiding the recesses with the red paint. Do this especially with the areas that you can view easily from above. And once again, go in with the black, paint the joints, and paint all the hoses. Once that's complete, I like to add a bit of contrast for the eyes, so I'm going to use a green for this one. Add in the gold for the crest, and then get the silver onto the hoses. Back to the Imperial Fist, I'm going to use the same flesh wash I used earlier, water down a little bit, and I'm going to cover the whole thing. Then I will carefully paint the black, trying not to get onto any of that yellow, and then paint the red for the front crest as well. Because the yellow is so translucent, it's very hard to repair any paint that goes where you don't want it to. So if there's any part of this project that you want to be careful, it is now. Before I moved on to the next step, I decided the Ultramarine needed to be a little bit brighter, so I just hit it with the dry brush again, just exaggerating those highlighted areas. It's important throughout any project to sort of step back and have a look and make any changes that you seem fit. Now, before we do any of the weathering, we're going to do the transfers. So you need a couple of things. You need the transfers, you need a little bit of water, and I like to put a bit of a sponge sitting in that water for the transfers to rest on. Cut them out as neatly as you can and lightly place the transfer you want into the water, making sure it's submerged and completely wet. Next, I like to put a little bit of water on the area that you're going to apply the transfer. This will help you position it once it's actually on the model. Once you are happy with that position, use a dry cotton bud or a cloth and lightly pat it down, getting rid of some of that excess water. And then you're done. Now I'd like to add some weathering to these figures, make them a little bit more realistic, a bit more grounded. So this is why we do this after the transfers are applied, so that they look like they're also weathered with the armor. So the trick to this looking effective is just think of where it would be most likely scratched, all the exposed areas or the corners and edges. If you water down your paint, it actually dries a little bit lighter than when you first apply it. And also using a really fine brush will help get those real crisp lines. For other areas that are heavily scratched up, just use the dry brush like near the feet. And I think this gives a good effect of all the battles that these Space Marines may have experienced over the years. Now, I mentioned earlier on about not gluing the bases to the figures, and this because I've ordered some 3D bases from eBay. Now, these are a sci-fi theme, which I've painted up to look a bit more dirty and grimy, very similar to what the board looks like. And I think these will just add a really nice finishing touch to complete the models. Speaking of finishing touches, time to magnetize the figures. So use the pin vise to drill your holes and make sure that the holes suit the size of the magnets you are installing. These need to be relatively flush to the figures so that they snap in the correct position. And it's a good idea to use the first gun to set the other magnets in the figures, that way you don't accidentally install the magnets with the wrong polarities facing out. And we are pretty much done. Now, just before the reveal, I'd like to give a big shout out to QLD NETWORKS for building my PC. This is a local business here in Australia. I let them know what I wanted. They also let me know what I needed to do what I do. And editing has been so much easier. So if you need to build, upgrade, or just need some advice, check them out. And I'll leave a link in the description below. Also, if you guys are enjoying this content, please come and support me on my Patreon page. It'll help this channel grow into something bigger and better. Cheers for hanging out.